Hello and welcome to the Test House webinar on testing with Visual Studio Online. This webinar was supposed to actually take place in October. However, due to a technical issue, we had to postpone the actual demonstration section, which I shall be getting onto in a little moment. But I'm going to represent the whole thing in full. Okay, just to reintroduce myself, my name is Ian Holdsworth and I work for Test House, which is a Microsoft Gold ALM partner. We specialise in all things testing and risk management. We have a number of blue chip companies in Europe and worldwide, including the likes of D-Logic, BBC, ExxonMobil, Capita, Visa Europe, to mention just a few, and many more. Visual Studio Online is essentially the Team Foundation server in the cloud, but it has a few additional add-ons that you don't normally associate with Team Foundation server as well, such as it has what we call elastic load testing, which is an Azure-based controller and agent rig which automatically scales depending on the amount of load you're actually giving it. So you can load test with 30,000 users. The way it's billed at the moment, although they haven't given full billing information, is that it's essentially based on the number of virtual user minutes that you actually work with. However, let me continue. So what is it? I've already explained a little that it's basically TFS in the cloud. So you've got all your collaboration tools, all your source control, you can do builds in the cloud, and you can do build verification tests in the cloud. However, at the moment you can't do coded UI tests, you can only do unit testing in the cloud. You can do your testing in the cloud again, so you can do your unit testing and you can do your web and load testing. There's also all the agile planning things that are normally included. What's new? Well, some of the new things that have come along with Visual Studio Online. Git support. Git support has come along with Visual Studio 2012 and 2013, but the cloud-based load testing is a new feature which has only recently come in, which I shall now be demonstrating. So, what can be achieved with load testing in the cloud? Well, we have unlimited virtual users. We can test web user interfaces, so we can just go in and test your websites. We can test web services, so we can test your behind-the-scenes APIs. We can also test things like Windows Communication Foundation. So almost everything you could normally test with a normal load test. That's the only limitation is you can't test coded UIs. You can also use your unit tests to essentially do your build verification tests, do web services, and test on deployed API clients or client APIs. Things that can't be done, like I've already said, coded UI. Currently, all of these things here on this slide, so MS test, goal-based load patterns, iteration-based runs, network mix property, warm-up and cool-down times, all of them, they are all on Microsoft's to-do list. They just haven't been implemented yet. So things that can't be done, you can't run it from the command line. So you can't have this set to go off at a scheduled time, if you like. So you can't use MS Test. Doesn't currently support goal-based load patterns, although they are still supported in Visual Studio, and if you have your own test controller and test agent rig. Obviously, a number of them are probably going to be implemented fairly soon. I think the main one that I'd be interested in seeing is IP switching, because at the moment with the cloud-based web testing, we can't actually do things to simulate getting through a load balancer because we can't do IP switching. So that's one that I'd really like to see, but they're going to be getting onto these fairly soon, I suspect. So let's get on with our first demo, connecting to Visual Studio Online. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my RDP connection to my Visual Studio machine, and first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to connect manually to Visual Studio Online using Visual Studio 2013. I just have to wait a moment whilst it loads. Essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect, and I'm just going to put the server name in. Okay, so I'm going to go to team, I'm going to go connect, and first thing it's done is it's just brought us up connect in Team Explorer, and I'm just going to select team projects. You've also got a little sign up option here. As you can see, we've currently got no servers set up, so I'm just going to type in my training instance of Visual Studio Online. So that's Test House Training, which is an instance that I use purely for training purposes. There's a demo project in there, and that's about it at the moment. And visualstudio.com. Click OK, and that should connect to Team Foundation Service. Oh, sorry, not Team Foundation Service, Visual Studio Online. Sorry, the rebranding has only taken place recently, and it's still taking a while to sink in. Okay, so that's how we're connected manually. Now if I minimize that and I go into Internet Explorer, there is another way. Actually, if I close that altogether and I go in and I go Test House Training at visualstudio.com, and it's going to ask me to sign in, so use my training account. Sorry, getting confused there for a second. I've got to actually use my training account, the email account. Sign us in, and there we can see we've got our demo project just there. We're in our Visual Studio Online, and one of the basic options is to open Visual Studio. This will only work with Visual Studio 2013, but other than that it should work perfectly. And bring it straight in, and it's taking us straight in and pretty much to where we were because we were already connected. But we should now be able to get into things like our projects. So that's how you connect to Visual Studio 2013. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're now going to talk about load testing in the cloud. There are a couple of prerequisites that you're going to need to know about. Firstly, if you're going to try this at home, you're going to need a system to test on. So you will need a website that you can test that is being exposed to the internet, that you can access from the internet. I say this because you don't really want to use someone else's site because you'll be using up their precious bandwidth and potentially causing a denial of service attack. Also, you'll need a TFS service account. I say TFS service account because quite a lot of the stuff in the setup, for the setup of the account, is still referring to it as TFS service. This will be changing over time, so it may already have changed in between me checking, double checking and triple checking it and actually recording this webinar. So Visual Studio Online is the new name, but there are still parts of it that refer to TFS service. And obviously you'll need a web performance test to actually perform your test with. You can use unit test if you like. However, I will be demonstrating with a web performance test. So what we're going to do is, well, we're going to connect to a test machine, but you've already seen me connect to the test machine, so you know what that's all about. Quickly create a load test. I'll just keep it mostly at all the default settings. One thing we will do is we'll connect the test settings file to TFS service or Visual Studio Online. And then what we'll do is we'll run the load test in the cloud, and we'll notice the differences that you'll see when it's actually running with TFS service or via Visual Studio Online. It is a little bit different, and then we'll have a quick look at analysing the results and some of the foibles that you need to know about with that in there with Visual Studio Online. So let's get cracking. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my virtual machine. Now that I'm actually connected, I'm going to go, right, I'm going to add a new item. The reason I go add new item is simply I just find it gets me into the habit of changing the name of the module before I even save it. So I'm just going to give it a name, click add, and here we can see this is pretty identical, so I'm going to leave this at mostly the default settings, leave the scenario, leave the pattern at just a constant 25 users, leave the text mix model. I am going to obviously add in our cloud test. So our web test is there. I'm just going to leave everything else at default except for, set that to 1. I'm going to leave that at 5 seconds because the minimum you can actually have when you're using Visual Studio Online is 15 seconds, and it will reset that for us. So I'll demonstrate just simply the fact that it resets that. Okay, so here we can see we've got our load test. Looks absolutely identical to a normal load test. One thing we also have to do is we have to go into test settings. Here we can see if we were going to run it as we normally would on just the local machine or a test controller, we've got options there, and we've got all the roles you might associate with that. Because we're going to be running it on the cloud, we're restricted in our options to deployment, setup and cleanup scripts, and some additional settings. Next, I'm simply going to apply that. You'll notice that if I actually just quickly go back to the general, this is an area that hasn't as yet gone through the rebranding process, so it's still referring to Team Foundation Service. Okay, so I've redirected us to the cloud. We're attached to the Test House Training Visual Studio Online. So if I go run the load test, we should see things look a little bit different than normal. First off, the first thing we actually need to pay any attention to is our demo cloud load test is initializing. Bear in mind, this is now taking place in Azure. So what it's actually doing at the moment is it's spinning up all the machines that it's going to use to actually run our test. We've also got some basic informational messages, so it's telling us that we're going to be using a minimum of 250 virtual users. It's just warning us that it currently doesn't support IP switching, so which isn't an issue for us at the moment because we're not actually demonstrating using this to generate load against a load balancer. We're also getting a warning because our sample rate was less than 15 seconds, so that has just been reset for us. And a little bit of info just to say which account we're actually doing this on. And essentially, basically what's happening at the moment is the resources are still spinning up and it will take a little while. We do have a stop button over here should we decide to abort. I'm not about to do that just at the moment. We can't get into graphs just yet because there's actually nothing to see, and there are no errors at the moment. We'll come back to that in a moment. Here we go, now it's actually running. I just scroll down slightly, we can see we have a graph. We've also got throughput as well. If I go back to performance, hopefully something will come up in it. There we go. So you can see, essentially what we're getting is our key indicators. So everything we'd normally get in our key indicators. So we've got user load, average response time, average page time, and average test time. And if we look at throughput, we're getting tests per second, pages per second, requests per second. We're also getting errors per second and user load. So this is an important one to keep your eye on when you're first actually running a test, because you don't want to run a 7-hour test and then come back to it and find that every test has failed. Okay, so we can see how much time it's actually spent of how much. So we've got 10 seconds left and then it should start saving the results. If I just quickly go over here into details, we can see we've got our 4 messages that I told you about earlier. We can also see the details of any errors in real time and essentially see exactly what's going on. So essentially now the test is just cleaning up after itself. It should download the results for us into its own load test repository, which we can then download for ours. So as you can see, it's now collecting results. This may take a moment or two. And it's completed, and we can just hit download report. It is important that you do download the reports. You can get into them again, but I always find I much rather actually make sure I have a copy locally. And if we go into view the report, you can see, here we go, we got all the same bits that we have normally. So in essence, we had one agent and an elastic controller. So if we'd gone for more if we'd gone for more virtual users, we would have had as many agents as it calculated it needed. We've got our usual graphs, our usual tables, and our usual detail section. And again, because this is in our local, if I add in my analysis notes, successful demo, and if I just quickly save that and close that, if I just go right click on here and open and manage results, because we've got it in our local test repository, there we are, successful demo, and we can just load it back up and we can see exactly the same as it was. Okay, so that's load testing in the cloud. I've also got some useful links for you for Visual Studio Online and some useful Azure links. So we've got some links for TFS service or Visual Studio Online. That's the basic sign-up page and information. We've also got some pricing information, we've got some news and updates, and we've got the web and load content index, which I actually manage. We've also, like I say, got some Azure information, some pricing, and some news and updates. Normally I'd ask if there are any questions and answers, but as this is being recorded after the fact, I will just proceed straight on and say thank you very much and hope to speak to you next time.